Hello, lovely artists. I've been on a bunch of forums recently, especially on watercolor forums, and I keep seeing the same question pop up, and that is how to mix greens. I wanted to do a little tutorial on mixing greens with a limited palette because I think, especially for on plein air painting and other fun things like that, where you have to be pretty mobile, I think mastering the limited palette is a really good choice. I use right now the Coatman Student Watercolor. I actually find them okay. I have a professional bunch coming, and I'll do a little like update tutorial on the differences that I find. But for now, this is sort of serving my purpose. Winsor & Newton is a pretty good brand in general. It comes in this handy little package. It's nice and small. So yeah, I do recommend it. The fun thing about this particular package also, I believe it's the 12 colors, is that it comes with a very standard palette choice. And this is a tested, tried and true palette. They give you this because you can get out of any mess. There are some color substitutions I'll talk about. For example, the alizarin crimson is not that light fast. However, I've done paintings in oil with alizarin crimson that are about 20 years old now, and I haven't had any problems with fading. So we're not talking like immediate term fading with these colors. These will serve you for both landscapes and portraiture, which is why it's just an awesome palette to master. You don't really need much else than this. For this particular tutorial, I'm sorry, it's going out of focus a little bit, but for this particular tutorial, I'm using acrylic, and that is only because I want the colors to really show up. As you can see with watercolors, they can be fairly, they kind of dry on the palette, leaving these sort of blotches. One thing that I do with this palette often, as you can see, I actually leave a fairly messy palette. And that's because the way that I mix is really intuitive, and I'm constantly grabbing my color. So essentially what I will do is I will mix I work from background to foreground in landscapes, and I will mix my grays first. It's a good starting point, and then you can mix your greens from there, and your browns and your warm and cool greens. And then as you're working, if you need to warm or cool a color, you already have little patches of different variations that you can mix straight in. And I find I get a really rich palette while working this way. And they tend to clump, as you can see, and sort of like here's my like blues to the warms, and then my more blue greens into my more warmer brown golden greens on this side. And it kind of works the same way over here. I have sort of this is more of like a magenta side, and this is like a hotter red side. So more towards the oranges. So this is sort of what ends up happening on my palette, and I don't clean these because I do find it handy to go in and grab actually from my pre-mixes. And this is one of the fun things about watercolor, is that you can re-wet this way. For my acrylics, if anyone's working actually with acrylics, I use the Stay Wet palettes. These will keep your paints wet forever. They will dry if they're out in the sun, but the minute you close it, it's airtight, and they will stay wet for weeks and weeks on end. So that's a cool way to sort of preserve paints. This palette works equally in oil. The quality of the paint does kind of count or matter, especially in acrylics. Sometimes with the lower quality, the burnt umber browns don't have enough pigmentation. So if you're trying to make black with your ultramarine, it will not happen. So that said, I'm going to switch to my screen because I've pulled a few little images from the internet, and I wanted to sort of go over some of what I see in especially beginner paintings with greens, and I think this is what's tripping people up with the mixing actually. What happens is, if we look at an image like this one, what we can see is that it looks like a very lush green environment. There's all of this lighting at play, so it's always dependent on the lighting in your scene, how the colors are going to read. So I've just gone through, and to show you how the greens are misleading, I've then put a mosaic filter on my image. So this kind of breaks the greens down in chunks. And then I also added a median filter to remove all the details, so we get sort of a better sense of the clumping colors. And then I went through and I color picked from the areas. And as you can see, despite the fact that this looks like a very green painting or image, the greens are actually really, really muted. So what I'm finding that I see, especially in a lot of beginner landscapes, are that the greens are much too saturated and overpowering, and even to the backs. So when I remove all of this again, so we see all of these greens in here, but if you look, they're actually incredibly gray. So because of the surrounding, we're reading this as a green, but it's actually quite blue-gray. And if you were to try to mix this as a green, which is I think what's happening, it will look out of place. It will pull the green forward. Generally speaking, greens get more gray to the blue and purples as they go backwards, as you can see in these colors. And they get more red to browns the closer we get to the camera. And that's because of atmospheric perspective. So I've just done a couple other little versions. So here, I'll turn these off so you can see, first of all. I didn't do my layers well on this one. I do apologize, but you can see again another really bright green environment. However, if I start to put the filters on it, we can see that in fact the greens are actually really very muted. So those are where they live in the painting. And then same with this one. So we've already got, let's say, our image right here. It's like a different environment. So I picked different lighting just to show the difference in how it reacts. But we do have this nice, still lush green foreground, and then we see some green on the rolling hills to the background. And then if I do my filter, removing the details, we get a better idea of how the colors are working in the painting. And then here is the palette that I picked off of the different areas. So as you can see, they actually disappear. It's so close, but when you look at the greens, they're actually quite gray. So definitely knocking back your saturation in your greens in your paintings is a must. And I think that's where a lot of the problems are occurring. The other advantage of using a limited palette is that the colors that you're mixing for the lighting and the sky are then being used and reading into the rest of the environment. So it will look a lot more cohesive than, let's say, doing a background with like cerulean blue and ultramarine blue, but then going in and grabbing a too green to create the greens in the painting, because it's not linking the color back to the sky and the atmosphere. It tends to look a little bit funny. So here I've put on my filter for the mosaic, and we can already start to see what's happening in the image a little bit more clearly in terms of gray. And then here's with the median. And then if I do my, oh, that was the gradient, I did a little test. Here's my color palette. So this one stands out. There's a few that kind of stand out, and it's only because with these filters on, I've lost some detail. So this sort of orangey color actually relates to, so this is where everything is living. The little dots have actually disappeared. This orange is actually relating, as you can see, to some of the sand or rock down here that are being hit by the sunlight. So this, when I put the filters on, looks out of place. As you can see also, we would normally read this consciously, the road and the rocks as a gray, because we understand mentally that those are gray. However, when we look at the color picked from the areas, they're actually quite purple. So this is something that you kind of need to keep in mind, and just like think of your sort of color biases, I guess, when you're looking at a landscape, and just remember that everything is actually probably way less saturated than you think it is going to be. So if I skip back to my palette now, so how do we mix out of this? And on my palette, I'm just gonna explain to you what this is. Just really quickly. On my palette, I have an ultramarine blue, a cerulean blue, a cadmium red pale. I do believe my, one of my, oh no, it is pale. Yeah, it's pale on both, so it's the same. No, it's light, so it'll be a little bit different, but it's cadmium light on my acrylics. It's a little bit brighter and more orange. The alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, cadmium yellow hue. This is hue, so it's not actually toxic. Yellow ochre and burnt umber. So this is what comes in the palette. I've removed all the extra colors that I think are a little bit fun but superfluous. So I've got the black and white. I don't use either of those. And then there's the Prussian blue and Viridian hue. Viridian, I love it as a color, but we can mix this with what's on the palette already, essentially. And if you add this into your painting, you're just going to break the illusion that everything lives together in the world. So it's fun to have, but you don't need it. So if you're on a budget and looking for a palette, this is a great one because you really don't need a lot of colors. I am using acrylic. I will treat it like watercolor and then I won't add any white. I will use the white of paper. You can obviously add whites to your acrylic if you need to, and you will get a whole bunch of different colors. So I'm actually just going to start right now. And like I said, I work from the background and I can just use maybe, let me see, I'll just use my examples as sort of, and I'll show you a comparison later, but I normally start with my gray. So to make a black, you can mix ultramarine blue and burnt umber. Just gonna mix this in together, and it's actually good. So yeah, the other reason why I'm doing this is because I can then, in acrylic, is I can keep my swatches and mix from them like I do on my very dirty palette, but I wanted to keep this clean for you guys. And I would say it's about 50-50. You might need to adjust, but we can always go from here. So, and then there's always warm and cool. So warm and cool are always at play in paintings. So you need to also keep this in mind. I'm just gonna add some water and I'm just gonna sort of pull this out. So right now, what I've got is a pretty warm gray color. I probably need to add a little bit more blue, but I'm just gonna like put this down on my warm side. So I've got this sort of brown gray at the moment. And then what you can do is take a little bit more of this and add a little bit more blue in here. And you will end up with a nice dark, cooler, I'm gonna go into this side maybe, a cooler gray. So we've got like a warmer brown and then a more closer to blue. And then again, if you wanted to, and this is why I love keeping my palette a bit messy. If we go in and add some cerulean to this, it will lighten it slightly, but it will also give me some of these even cooler gray colors. And then from here, it's literally just a matter of continuing to adjust the quantities of blue versus brown into your mix. So I'm just going to continue adding a little bit of cerulean because I want to go nice and cool. I could even add a little bit more of the ultramarine if I wanted to switch or sort of shift the hue. A little bit more, that wasn't quite enough. There we go. So here I've got a section of grays that can work towards the background of my painting, that go from sort of a neutral coolish gray to a very blue gray. This will work really well for atmosphere in the sky and if you've got like any kind of fogs or anything. And then so if I go from my initial mix, that was a little bit red. And then from here, so I'm gonna pull some of this out. From here, I can start adding either more burnt umber, which is sort of a, as you can see, it's sort of a yellowish, or I could then go through and add either one of these reds. So if I wanted to hue shift a little bit more towards the purple, this will give me a nice, it's maybe a little bit much, but you'll at least see it. It's going to give me something that's still fairly mute, but towards a blue sort of red color. If of course, I took this and I added a little bit more of my burnt umber to shift it that way. I want it to be pure, so I'm just going to knock it back. And then this is too, like, this is way too yellow, so this is where I could come in and grab some of this mix. That's sort of a gray cerulean, just to knock that back a little bit, because I'm using the complementary color. So if this is yellow, I need something that's a little bit purple. It's still a little bit much. I'm going to grab some more of this sort of purple in here. So I do use my mixes a lot when I'm doing this. So now I've got sort of a gray brown. And then let's see, I haven't necessarily pre-planned these colors. I'm just kind of going with what I think I might need in a painting. And let's say I were to take this sort of mix again, and if I wanted to go warm but a bit lighter, I could add a little bit of my yellow ochre to this. So you can either go, you know, towards your yellow color. This will make it a bit more gold, or you can go, I'm going to add a little bit of this alizarin here to just knock it back a tiny little bit. And then here I've got something that's a little bit more golden, but still quite desaturated and dark. And then once you have these grays built up, you can start building off of them. So if we go, let's say, into some cool blue greens, let's first take the obvious choices, which are my ultramarine blue and my cadmium yellow. And now obviously, so if I start here with this color, and I'm just going to sort of pull it out a little bit. So obviously, if I add more of this yellow into the mix, it's just going to start becoming more and more lighter and more yellow. So just by changing the ratio of this, and if I pull some of this back and then add a little bit more like blue in there, obviously I'm going to get a darker blue green. So, but here's the issue that I have with these particular colors. Well, they are beautiful. If you actually look at the photos that I showed you as a reference, these colors are actually much too saturated. So it is easy with this palette to get really, really saturated colors. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're very realistic. So I'm just going to pull these out for a second. And this would be sort of an option that you would have for some cooler blues or cooler greens. This gives you a nice dark, sort of emerald blue green. And actually, I just want to do a really quick comparison with my Viridian, just to show you a comparison in here of what this color is. So it's actually, if I just put this, this is why I say this isn't necessarily the color that you need on here. This is way too saturated out of the box. And if I get the ratio of this correct, I can get colors that are similar to these. But as you can see already, that Viridian green is way too intense. So if we put this directly on our painting, it's actually not going to make any sense. I'm just going to pull out some of these ones so you can see them. And then this one had just a little bit more of that yellow in it. So these are sort of my high chroma greens that I might use as sort of highlights or details in a painting. If we did the exact same trick, but I use, instead of my ultramarine, I take my cerulean and I add the same yellow, so my cadmium yellow. We are going to get a different series of blues. As you can see, different pigments have different staining abilities. So the cerulean is a lot less intense than the ultramarine. So if I want to get a similar bluish tint out of this, I need to add a whole lot more of this cerulean in the mix. So this is still really very cool. So right now I've got something that's similar to this in value, but it's much more towards like a blue than a gold. And then we'll just pull this out. I'm going to try to add a little bit more blue on this side. Just so you can see sort of the range that you can get off this one particular very limited palette. So there we've got something more into the foresty, cool color, and then I'm going to add more yellow into this one. On this side, it won't take much actually. It's probably even a bit much. But you can go quite high chroma by doing this. All right, so now I've got sort of an interesting representation of the spectrum of that. Again, if you just added even more cerulean blue, you could go straight from basically a cerulean all the way through to your yellow. I'm sort of doing limited swatches right now. So here we have a dark blue-green that is absolutely not the same as this palette here, but gives us a nice range on these sort of high chroma greens. So again, I don't actually think I would use these particular colors in my painting because they are a little bit too high chroma and saturated. You would reserve these definitely for highlights in the foreground. If you put these in the background, with the exception of maybe these two, you might ruin your painting. So what do we do? So now we've got these high chroma greens that are possibly not going to work. So I'm actually going to take, because I have my mixes, and I'm just kind of going to do this randomly, but you'll get the logic. If I take, let's say, my mid-tone green here, and I want to knock it back, I now have all of these brown red colors to work with. So let's just say for fun, and I'm actually going a little bit off script here, so I'm actually gonna, so let's just say I put this one down here as a gray green. And then obviously you can do the exact same exercise as this, but with your gold green. So we'll make those ones next. But now I've knocked it back with that sort of more blue, the more blue grays. And if I take the same color here, and then I go in with some of these redder that are more to the alizarin, I'm going to get this much more desaturated because red is a complementary of green. I start getting into these really nice subdued earthy tones, which are actually, if you remember the swatches that I created on those photos, these are actually a lot closer to what you're finding in a natural landscape. I think what's happening is we see these colors when we look at it, but actually what we're getting are these in reality. So the same thing, you could take these lighter colors and let's see if I can grab some of this. I'm gonna have to add a little bit in there. So this is exactly why I keep a dirty palette, because I can go in and just grab what's here already. So I'm just trying to go through and add some of these gray greens to this just to knock this color back. So we've already got like 3 different variations just by taking the same mixes. So again, like the same thing, you could take from this batch, and let's just do, for the sake of argument, I add this sort of warmer reddy brown gray mix in here. I'm going to get something that's even slightly more olivey. And then again, it's just the matter of the ratio that you're adding, the green versus your grays. And then if we take the same arguments, so I'm actually just going to put out a little bit more cerulean blue. All right, now I'm going to take my palette knife, which I've dropped in my water. It's a good place for it. I'm going to take now my ultramarine, and then this is where we can make some more golden greens. And I'm going to take my yellow ochre. And as you can see with the staining power of that blue, so this one, it sort of, because the yellow ochre is already almost a complementary to the ultramarine, you're already going to get something that's sort of gold and desaturated, which is kind of interesting. I'm just going to sort of mix this out a little bit better. And I'm just going to add a little bit more. So if you remember, in some of those examples, we have some more sort of subdued gold colors. This is how you can go about getting those. So if I just put some of this mix here, I have like a warmer but desaturated golden green. Obviously, if you wanted to play with this a little bit, you could try adding some of your cadmium yellow in, and this is going to react a little bit differently with the ultramarine that's in there, and you're going to get something that's a little bit more like this. So now we have 2 colors that are going to work really well together, that are both a little bit muted, but are in the golden range, as opposed to like the blue color range. And if I take the cerulean and I mix my yellow ochre, I'm going to get a whole different set of muted golden greens. Pull this out a little bit. So if I put these down, take some of this that's a little bit more bluish. And then I'll take some of this one that's a little bit more golden. Not quite enough blue in there. I went a little bit too far to the yellow ochre, but here we go. And then, of course, like the last example, you could take some of this yellow and add it. You could take some of, now that you've got these mixes, you can start intermixing. So let's say I wanted this just to be a little bit more blue, and then I wanted to add a little bit more of this. Now I can mix these all together and I get a completely new sort of warm golden green that is still a bit mute, which is perfect for reality. And then we also have all the purples. So I would use the same logic. And actually, like, I haven't even added any of my cadmium color to any of this mix. So if I really wanted to knock something back, let's say I had this mix here, which is quite intense. If I wanted to knock this back a bit, I can take a tiny little bit of this cadmium, which is sort of an orange red, and mix that in there. It's not going to take much. It could easily overpower that. But now I'm going to get an entirely different desaturated blue-green color. It's another nice sort of gray, neutral gray that we can add. Maybe for some rocks or something. And then obviously purples. There are two interesting purples you can get out of this palette. I haven't even touched my, oh I did, I touched my burnt umber in the beginning part for my gray. I usually use it for my grays and my blacks to start out with. If you need to darken your blacks, obviously you can add some alizarin crimson just because it's a dark color. It might make things more purple so that you can knock it back with maybe your yellow, one of your yellows, just to sort of dull that back out again. So yeah, purples. We take obviously ultramarine blue, and this is going to give us something that's fairly desaturated if I add the cadmium, because it's sort of a complementary. And obviously the ratios are going to change everything. So whether or not I go more toward the blue by adding more blue or red, we're just going to get sort of a gradient on this. Just, let's see, I'll push it both ways for fun. Just add some more red. That's probably way too much. I still want it to be somewhat purple. That cadmium can be really overpowering, so you got to watch your staining power a little bit. But now I've got an even warmer purple. And then if I do the same thing with my, I just lost my paper. If I do the same thing, I can take my ultramarine blue, which I'm running out of, add a little bit more. So while I did say this is a tutorial about green, as you can see from my images that I pulled out, you actually kind of need these other colors for the context, because they don't live in isolation from the colors around them, and putting something that looks gray that is in the green tones towards a purple will actually make it look much more green in comparison. So right now I'm just mixing up my ultramarine blue and my alizarin crimson. And as you can see, it actually gives me something that's fairly close to a dioxane purple. So if you need a purple on your palette and you don't want to buy one, this is a pretty good mix. An alizarin crimson and an ultramarine blue. These are really good for your background planes in your paintings. And it will give the background layers something for your greens, your gray greens to sit on. You could actually make these colors look fairly green just by having them next to one of these purples. It's really deceiving how they change based on what's surrounding them. So let's say I'm going to do the same example. I'm just going to take my cerulean blue, and I will first add it to the cadmium, and I don't think that this is going to make a lot of sense, but I'll try it anyways. It's going to give us something really saturated, which will make it possibly a nice background blue-gray color, honestly. In fact, it's quite a beautiful color. But they're almost complementary to each other, so it's going to give us something that's fairly gray, but still in the purple tones. It's actually quite a beautiful gray color. And obviously, we can tilt that to be more red or blue, depending on how much of the red or blue we put in there. And obviously, if you mix it into any one of your other green mixes, it's going to react differently. So if you've got something that's way more yellow and you need to knock it back, like this color, if you need to knock it back a little bit, you could add one of these colors into it and it will help desaturate it, but you will still have something sort of in this family as a starting point. So I always think about the starting point. What do I have and where am I trying to go with the colors? And then, yeah, so we did, obviously, now we make the cerulean blue and alizarin crimson, and this gives like really beautiful purples. I love these colors. These are just such beautiful purples with these two. And then, obviously, we can push it more. Oops, that was a lot. More towards the red. And more towards the blue. So what I've given you here is essentially, in terms of landscape painting and greens, I've also developed a complementary palette for you to be able to effectively knock back all of your colors to be something that's a little bit more natural and desaturated. So yeah, I hope that's it, or that's good for you guys. If you have questions, don't hesitate to write to me in the comments. I will actually make this available on my website, including the sample images that I showed with the swatches, as well as I'll take a photo of this and add it, and a listing of the colors and some of the mixes that I used. But essentially, this is sort of a starting point. Obviously, by intermixing with all of these colors, you're going to have just an infinite amount of greens and combinations that you can mix for your landscapes. So yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you guys again.